Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. This one has taken a fair while really, as there are some tricky tanks here, so thanks for bearing with me on this one. Anyway, without wasting any more of your time, let's get into them. As always, I really hope you enjoy. So, starting off very strong today with the Cromwell 5. This is a highly versatile medium tank with near light tank levels of mobility, minus the standard terrible reverse gear though. It comes equipped with a new gun for the tier, the Ordnance Quickfire 75mm, which is very similar to the gun the early Shermans use, the 75mm M3 gun. The penetration values of these guns are practically identical, except the Cromwell doesn't use a round with HE filler. But either way, the gun isn't bad. Protection wise, it's not too bad either. Has around 64mm on the frontal hull and turret, with 46mm on the sides. Like the Crusaders, the side armour is double stacked again. So what we essentially have here is a very versatile tank with a lot going for it, which is something we haven't really had yet. The only real drawbacks it has are the lack of reliable armour and reverse gear, and both of these can be countered to some degree. Your armour does allow for some angling, but not really enough to reliably block any of the more potent incoming shots. Angling the corner of your turret and hull towards the enemy might save you a bit, but it's not going to work all the time. Something that does work, but takes a lot of getting used to, is accelerating as soon as the enemy fires. If you're slightly angled and drive forward as soon as the enemy fires or is about to fire, they usually hit your heavily angled side armour and bounce. This is something that takes a long time to perfect and doesn't always work, but if you've had a few coffees, you can probably react quick enough and bounce a few shots this way just down to how fast this tank accelerates. The second downside is the reverse gear, and my advice would just be to never reverse. Now, that probably sounds fairly stupid, and well, it might be, but when backing out of a situation, it's actually quicker to turn around than drive off. The Cromwell has neutral steering, which makes turning very easy and quick. Using this in tandem with your roof-mounted smoke grenades will allow you to back out of a tricky situation with relative ease. You might still get caught out from time to time, but reversing is basically never the way to go. As for playstyle, the Cromwell works quite well aggressively. Securing those vital spots early game can really help you and your team out, as around this BR tanks generally begin to slow down again as we break into tier 2, less light tanks and many more medium tanks. And because of this, you can afford to rush without too much worry really. Find a good spot covering a commonly travelled route, hull down if you can, and cover it until all the tanks from the initial push are out. If you are hull down, make sure your hull is sideways relative to the cover you're behind. This way, if you get into trouble, you can just drive off. If your hull is pointed towards the cover, you're going to have to reverse or swing the hull around to then escape, which will lose you vital seconds. Positioning yourself sideways behind cover is a good habit to get into for pretty much all British tanks. For the late game, zipping around from cover to cover and just staying on the move will be pretty effective for you. Also, try and make sure you're driving at an angle towards enemies or where you think enemies will most likely be. Your armour will never be great, but in showing your angled side, it presents your enemies with a choice, either shooting the side or the front, and usually one of these will bounce and you can return fire. The Cromwell is great at making itself a hard target to take out. So, pros: great mobility, good firepower, and versatile. And the cons: poor reverse gear, and its armour can't really be relied on. Verdict: get it. The Cromwell and tanks like it really just make the backbone of most lineups around this tier, and there are a lot of tanks that play very similar to this one, so mastering how it plays will really help along the line. And coming up next is one such vehicle. Next up is the Cromwell 1. This is completely identical to the previous tank apart from its gun. This uses the 6-pounder 57mm, same as the Crusader Mark III. It gets a shoulder stabilizer as well and a few extra smoke grenades, but that really is it. So I won't waste your time in explaining how this tank plays, as it is pretty much exactly the same as the Cromwell 5, just with a faster firing, more reliable gun. Being a smaller caliber, it does struggle a bit more with sloped armour, but it still fires very quick and does a lot of damage, so it's a worthy trade-off. Pros and cons are exactly the same, as well as the verdict here, get it. It's at a higher BR, but still works very well, and to be honest, it's easily one of my favourite tanks in this tree. Next up is a bit of a shift from tradition. This is the Sherman 2. It's basically the M4A1 Sherman in the US tree, just at a slightly higher BR, and that's because this variant is equipped with the T45 APCR round. Not really enough to warrant the BR increase, but I think they just wanted to make it appear slightly more unique, so here we are, I guess. Needless to say though, it still performs brilliantly, and having a capable APHE round is a real breath of fresh air for the tree. It's nowhere near as mobile as the Cromwells, but it makes up for that in firepower. The APHE from this cannon will one-shot very, very consistently, and it can still pen a decent amount on top of that. It's also equipped with a short stabilizer as well that keeps the gun still up to 15 km an hour, which is really great for snapshots. Like the Cromwells though, its armour can't really be relied on, but it does still bounce here and there, especially on the turret, and from smaller caliber rounds that struggle to pen the sloping on the front plate. The Sherman is a proper jack-of-all-trades tank. It has decent armour, decent mobility, and a decent gun, and just plays accordingly really. There aren't many tips and tricks to it I can really give you. This is one of those vehicles that I like to call tanks. Your inherent playstyle just takes over while playing these vehicles, as they're almost universally capable. As long as you can land shots and put yourself in a good position, you'll have a good time. The Sherman has some very forgiving aspects to it, but the main drawback really is the armour. Hull down, it's not too bad, but the hull does have some exploitable weak spots, mainly the corners of the hull. You never really want to angle this tank because it neutralises the angle on the sides of the hull, which are really easy to pen by pretty much any gun. The only time you will want to angle is if you're baiting a shot around a corner. Generally though, you're going to want to stay flat on. The common German 75 can still cut through you at pretty much any range and angle, so focus the vehicles using it if you have the opportunity, as you are relatively immune from the other smaller guns. The Sherman works great defensively and aggressively. Your short stabilizer will really help get the first shot off on any tank on the move. So, pros? Great firepower, good mobility, effective stabilizer, and versatile. And the cons? Unreliable armour. Verdict? Get it? It's a proper jack-of-all-trades tank, and it lives up to that expression very well. And believe me when I say, you will have a lot of fun with this tank. So, next up is the Matilda II. It's our first mainline heavy tank and shares a lot in common with the Valentine we covered in the last episode, especially in its temperamentality. It does lose the very obvious weak spots in favour of one or two small ones. It uses the same gun and has very, very similar mobility. Its armour though is improved all around. It's 75mm across the whole turret, front plate, and effectively the sides as well. So even though the armour is good and better than the Valentine, it still suffers from exactly the same issues pretty much. Either what you're fighting can pen you easily everywhere, or it can only pen the weak spots. And the main thing the Matilda has over the Valentine is that its weak spots are harder to hit. No death by 20mm this time around. Hopefully. But the main problem still does remain. You can roll around and stomp everything you fight, or get one shot by something that can negate your armour from pretty much all angles and ranges. So what can we do with it? Well, at its BR 2.7, the Matilda is what a heavy tank in this game should be. A tank that can be penetrated with a good shot, but can't just be blind fired to death like light tanks and most medium tanks. The advantage a heavy tank should have is a reaction time window. Your enemy can't pen your armour everywhere most likely, but they can pen your weak spots. In this example, it's the turret ring and a small block on the front plate. Most tanks you will see can get through these points, but they require aiming to hit them, and what that does is create a time window for you to fire back, and the Matilda can take serious advantage of this window. It has the short stabilizer and a cruise gear that keeps it locked, and at close range your gun can still cut through most tanks with ease. So when everything is going right, the Matilda can be very, very tricky to deal with. This thing works best at brawling at close range. At 2.7, the 2-pounder is slowly losing its potency and you'll want all the power you can get out of it. So close range is where I'd stick to. Also, know your enemy. You're going to want to approach a fight one of two ways. If what you're fighting can't negate your armour, keep the cruise gear on, slightly angle, and stay on the move to knock out their gunner as fast as possible. You want to make it difficult for them to hit your weak spots. If the tank you're fighting can negate your armour, you're going to want to bait a shot. You can do this, but not amazingly convincingly. The best way to do it will be to show a sliver of your angled front plate. There is a slight chance the German 75 will still pen, but if you angle it just right, you should be safe. This is the main gun to watch out for, and you'll need to be careful when fighting it. But if you can bait a shot, you can comfortably knock out whatever tank is using it. So, pros? Good effective armour. And the cons? Poor mobility, and poor versatility. Verdict? Consider it. Taking this tank out is a bit like a coin flip. You might not meet anything that can pose much of a threat to you and have a great game, or you could run into an F2 and get one shot before you have time to react. This tank is heavily dependent on map and BR, and for that reason it shouldn't really be a tank you rely on, but can be very fun potentially. Next up is the 3-inch gun carrier. This is a casemate TD on the Churchill chassis, and actually it really isn't that bad. It has 89mm of armour on the front and 76 on the sides, which leaves a lot of potential for angling. In fact, if you angle with the corner where the two plates meet towards the enemy, you can become almost completely immune from the German 75, which is largely going to be the most dangerous common gun you'll face. Though when stock it is quite the slug, it turns very slow, and in general its mobility is pretty poor, which doesn't allow for the quick reactions you need to make the armour actually effective. So I'd go for the mobility upgrades, especially tracks, as fast as possible. As being on the Churchill chassis, it does have neutral steering, which really does help. The main key to having a good time with this tank is to always angle. Bait the shot from who you're fighting, and you should have a good few seconds to knock them out. This is how this tank works best, and it can work so well in fact, that it can become almost invulnerable, in the right circumstances. Secondary to angling, the main thing to focus on playstyle wise is your positioning and how to best advance from your initial position. Make sure to look at the BR too. If you're at 3.7 or 4.0, you can definitely still play this tank, but you'll likely run into a lot of tanks wielding the German 75, which can't pen you while you're angled, but can easily catch you out. Staying at range and making sure you're in a spot that can't be easily flanked will be your best bet. The further at range you are, the more time you'll have to angle before a shot comes in. Your gun is pretty good and can knock out practically all German tanks and most Russian tanks relatively easily. If you are at 3.0 though, you can pretty much play the spearhead. There's very few tanks that can easily take you out, so if you push through the map with your teammates, you can, in the right circumstances, roll through teams, take most of the hits, and let your team help in taking out any of the lighter vehicles that could get on your sides. Now of course, matches probably won't go as dreamily as I've just described, but your angling potential really does give you a lot of options here. The one thing you can't counter is an enemy getting behind you. You have 25mm on the back plate, which pretty much anything can pen. If an enemy does get behind you, angle heavily to your side. You just want to entice the enemy to not shoot your back plate. So show your side at a very harsh angle and you might survive a few shots. So, pros: decent firepower and great armour. And the cons: poor mobility and poor versatility. Verdict: get it. A lot of people don't seem to like this tank, but as soon as you get the hang of angling, you really can do well. Just be mindful of the map and the BR you're playing at, and I'm pretty sure you'll have a good time. Next up is our second and, to be honest, first true heavy tank, the Churchill Mark I. This tank is ridiculously armoured for the tier, having 100mm on the turret front and 90mm on the front plate. But because of how the tracks are arranged, you can angle and have your hull become completely immune from incoming fire. Sounds pretty good, right? And, well, it is. The main drawback really is the slow speed and the gun. This is the last time we'll see a tank that uses the 2-pounder, so that's a 1.0 tank's gun, now at 3.0, so as you can imagine, it does start to struggle a little bit with certain tanks. But largely, it will still get the job done. It does also have a howitzer in the hull that can fire HE rounds or smoke rounds. You can have a bit of fun getting hull breaks with the HE, but I'd mainly just fill it with smoke. How I'd suggest playing this tank is similar to a safer Matilda. Your armour is a lot more effective and you can easily deal with several tanks at once, so you can play the spearhead in that regard. But staying on the move again is pretty important. You do, like the Matilda, have a pretty big turret ring that's fairly easy to hit no matter what angle you're at, so be wary of this. However, most players don't really know to shoot there, but it's still worth keeping in mind just in case. You do have some decent fallbacks though in terms of your smoke ability. You have 25 roof-mounted smoke grenades and a secondary that fires smoke rounds at a decent pace. So if you're in trouble, I would suggest using them. Even some of the stronger guns need a well-placed shot to take you out, and if you can smoke yourself, or even better, fire a smoke round right at them, you can effectively reset the engagement, which can make you a really annoying tank to deal with. Stay on the move and aim to disable the gunner of whatever you're fighting, and you should stay decently safe. But again, like the Matilda, your effectiveness is heavily influenced by the map and BR you're playing at. So, pros: great armour, and the cons: poor mobility and poor versatility. Verdict: get it. This tank can be very fun and is a lot more reliable than the Matilda. If you're in a 3.0 game, you can pretty much turn your brain off and just have a great time, but at the higher tiers it can become a bit tedious to use. Its main advantage though is that it fits nicely into the 3.0 lineup, so get it for that, especially if you're thinking of staying around that BR for a while. Next up is the Valentine Mark 11. This is essentially an upgun Mark 1 but with some changes. First off, it loses 10mm of side armour, doesn't have a weak spot on the driver's port, and also gets some little pieces of extra armour in front of the turret ring, which does help a little bit. The turret's also got a redesign. I found it's a little easier to pen actually. The MG port flattens the armour out a little bit. Its mobility though is a tiny bit better. Its top speed is the same, but it's a lot more reactive mobility wise. The main change though is the gun. This uses the same gun as the Cromwell 5, so for 3.0 it is good, it just isn't really outstanding. The effectiveness of a gun mostly relies on the platform it's on, and at 3.0 the Valentine's effectiveness does start to slip, especially as far as armour is concerned, which is a bit of a problem. The previous Valentine, the Mark 1, did have meaningful advantages. Its armour could negate a lot of the guns it faced, and this coupled with a very fast firing gun that could easily pen everything relatively easily, made for a tank that under the right conditions could easily stomp. The Mark 11 though can't reliably do this. Its armour now can't really negate many shots, and its gun can't quickly take out tanks at the rate the Mark 1 could. The gun does one shot, but it does also struggle. It's not consistent is what I'm trying to say. On top of this, there's no short stabilizer this time around either, which makes it harder to use on the move, which hits its versatility to a point where it stops really becoming all that versatile. As for how to play it, a dull but reliable way to play it would be to camp hull down at a fair range. Your turret armour isn't the best, but at distance it should still be able to withstand general fire. Anything you could pen at close range you can still pen at distance, give or take, so your firepower will remain as effective as it always would be if you play like this. Using the Valentine this way negates most of its most prominent drawbacks, the mobility, the gun handling, and to an extent the armour. This is definitely the safest way to play it, but the least impactful and the most dull. It can play conventionally, dare I say, just driving around and fighting like normal. Just keep in mind that you'll meet vehicles playing this way that will outclass you in some capacity most of the time. The best thing to do is to stay angled always, even as you just drive around. If you're on the move when you're being shot at, you can pressure an enemy into firing at you, and this usually means they're not going to be aiming for a particular weak spot, which to be honest is really just the best chance you've got. So, pros, decent gun. And the cons, poor effective armour, poor mobility, and poor versatility. Verdict, avoid it. It's taken me a few hours to actually write this section in its entirety just because this tank has so little going for it and there's nothing to really take advantage of, so there's very little meaningful advice I can really give for it. I was planning for a considerate verdict here, but I realised there just isn't any reason to pick it up. It's a tank that only functions at the most basic level, and that's about it, sadly. Next up is something very similar, the Valentine Mark 9. The only change here apart from a slight redesign on the turret is the gun. This uses the 6-pounder, which does give somewhat of an advantage to this late Valentine. Everything else though is the same. Poor mobility and unreliable armour. I won't spend too long on this one just because of the similarities. All this one does different is allow for you to take out most tanks faster and more reliably. The turret does lose the MG bulge, and this does make the turret a little bit bouncier, so playing hull down will be a bit more advantageous this time around. The only thing that'll make these two tanks work really is going to be good positioning. So hide your hull and cover a cap point to be safe, or just again, drive around at an angle and hope for the best. Pros? Good gun. And the cons? Poor effective armour, poor mobility, and poor versatility. Verdict? Get it. This is what I'd round your 3.0 lineup off with. It's not a bad tank to use late game. Your gun will be able to dispatch everything pretty much, and by that time most of the best tanks the enemy team have won't be driving around, which levels the playing field a bit for you. It's never going to be a great tank, but with good positioning and a bit of luck, it might just be a good one. Next up is everyone's firm favourite, the Archer. This is the infamous tank destroyer that houses its cannon backwards, and as you can imagine, that makes it very tedious to play. Its advantage though is that it has one of the most overwhelmingly powerful guns for the tier, the 17-pounder, which at 10 meters can cut through 190mm of flat armour. But The potential the gun has means nothing when it can't get into a good position to actually fire on enemies, and that's really the main flaw of the Archer, or rather, the start of the main set of flaws it has. The gun of course points backwards, which means to actually drive to a position where the gun is pointed towards the enemy, you need to reverse. And the reverse gear is 4 km/h max, and this is the main point of tedium for the tank. The problem really is deciding when to turn around. If you turn around when you actually see enemies, you'll probably be shot before you can actually get the gun around, and if you turn around too early, well, you'll probably be driving at a snail's pace for a fair while before you even see anyone, and that's if you see anyone. For playstyle, it's all about positioning and having a set game plan. This is probably one of the least versatile tanks in the game, so having a set criteria of how to play it will be really helpful here. What you want to look out for is a long sight line not too far into the map, and a hull down position you can easily retreat from. This tank is actually fairly good at retreating, considering that it accelerates backwards effectively. So if there's shots coming in you can't counter, or your breach gets hit, you can easily just drive into cover and repair. Keeping at extreme ranges is a good idea as well. You have good gun depression and a high velocity cannon, and if you're in cover, you can probably get away with your enemy missing a few shots before they get their rounds on target. You're also going to want to cover as large a sightline as possible, as you're going to want to stay sedentary for as long as you can. And considering your gun traverse is abysmal, the closer to an enemy you are, the harder it's going to be overall to take them out. Engagement range shouldn't be a problem, so the larger area you cover, the better. Try and find a spot that's not too far into the map, as it makes it less likely that you're going to get flanked, and remove some of the tedium of crawling into the battlefield to get better shots. The Archer is best used early game as a first spawn, as later on in the match, enemy tanks will likely be all over the place, so it'll be quite likely you'll run into one and get shot in the back, or front, or whatever. Pros? Great gun. And the cons? Poor survivability, poor mobility, poor versatility, etc, etc. Verdict? Consider it. That might surprise some of you, but it really does have its merit. If you're using a 3.7 lineup, this is a good backup option if you get up tiered, as you will still be able to pen everything very easily. So if you plan on making a 3.7 lineup, I definitely would get it. Lastly, for the main tree vehicles today is our anti-air. This is the AC Mark II AA, and it's pretty good and relatively versatile actually. It's on a very mobile chassis and has decent anti-tank and decent anti-air ability. It uses twin 20mm cannons with HE and AP rounds. The AP rounds can pen a max of 42mm at point blank, which for 2.7 is actually not bad. You can cut through a fair few Russian tanks and hassle most of the Germans as well. You can also knock out Panzer IVs through the turret ring if your aim is good too. So this is an AA that you can somewhat reliably go tank hunting with as long as the BR isn't too high. The 20mm do well against aircraft, but they're not amazingly consistent. It's the point where I've actually had the most success against aircraft using the AP belt. It just seems to knock wings off and takes out engines much easier. So honestly, I would just stick with a default belt, which is 1 AP to 1 HE, or just go with the full AP belt. I wouldn't use the full HE belt at all, as it pretty much cuts your versatility in half, and at least in my experience hasn't been too effective against planes anyway. For playstyle, since it's an AA, it's quite hard to say as you're very limited in what you can do. If you want to go and attack tanks, bear in mind your armour actually isn't that bad. You have 50mm on the turret and an oddly angled hull, so if you're hull down, you can bounce some shots from early rounds if you angle your turret, which can be quite amusing. Generally though, you're just going to want to zip around cover and not stay in the open for too long. You can pen most vehicles somewhere frontally, whether it be the turret ring or just all over. For tanks you can't though, you're better off just not engaging. Just hide and wait for them to pass, or for them to expose their weaker side or rear armour. If you do get caught out, try and shoot for the enemy's barrel. Even if you don't destroy it, you can make it hard for them to actually hit you. Your camera in the gun view is attached to the end of your barrel, so spamming it with fire blocks the scope effectively, and this might give you enough time to get away. So, pros? Good mobility, good anti-air ability, and good anti-tank ability. And the cons? It's not really very survivable, I guess. Verdict? Of course, get it, it's a big improvement over the previous anti-air we've got so far, and you can reliably knock out tanks with it too. So for the lower tiers, it'll do you just fine. And you might need to get the hang of these guns, as this platform will be your anti-air for a fair while to come. So next up are our premiums, and this time around there's not really many good options, or rather not many cost-effective options. To start off with, we have the two marketplace premiums, the Grant 1 and the AEC Mark II. I won't be going into these two very much, as there's no way I recommend buying them at their current prices. The Grant has less than 20 units left on the market and is currently just under 30 Gaijin coin, and the AEC has 8 on the market and is currently selling for just under 90 coins. Ouch. So, safe to say, these two vehicles are not worth the money. The Grant is an exact copy of the Grant in the US tree, just with different camos, but the AEC is unique. It's on the same chassis as the previous AA we just covered, but with the 57mm 6-pounder gun. It does also get scouting, and to be honest it is really good, but just not worth the money currently. I'd pick the Grant up if the price ever drops to around 10 to 15 Gaijin coin, or the AEC if it ever comes down to about 20 to 25. For now though, honestly, you're much better off avoiding them. For our GE premium though, we have the Cromwell 5 RP3. This is of course a Cromwell 5 with RP3 strapped to it. It does look pretty promising, but it isn't really in practice. I'd almost go as far as to say that the RP3s actively make it worse. Some external munitions such as these RP3s can explode while still being strapped to the tank, and unsurprisingly this does blow the tank up. They don't explode by being hit directly, but do explode on hit with secondary fragments such as artillery or any kind of explosive round hitting near the rockets. These fragments are thrown around a lot, so having the RP3s on is actually a pretty big detriment, and you'd be better off just loosing them at the start of the match.
It just blows you up, man. Oh dear.
They will knock out anything they hit though pretty much, especially considering they use the old RP3 model and pen 75mm at all angles. You can't exactly aim them though. They're strapped still to the turret and you can't adjust their trajectory. They're angled for impact at about 300 meters give or take. But generally, what you'll find happens is that you go out of your way to try and put yourself in a position where the RP3s might connect, and this usually on its own will get you killed. You'll get into a situation where you could shoot an enemy tank with your, to be honest, decent gun, but instead try and use the rockets. This wastes time and gives away your position as the sound they make is pretty loud. So, is it worth it? Well, this tank doesn't present the clearest mindset for gameplay, and you can blow up from the tiniest arty hit. And for those reasons, and considering it's 3,450 golden eagles, it really isn't worth it. You'd be much better off putting a talisman on the regular Mark V, which is around 5 times cheaper. Well, that's all our tanks for today. I think actually this has been the most vehicles in a video so far, so sorry if this is getting a bit lengthy, we will wrap up soon. Before that though, I'll go through the planes for this tier. First off, we're starting with the Martlet. This is basically an F4F Wildcat but in British service. This variant is unique, but it performs almost exactly the same as the F4F4, though it can't carry any bombs, so why am I suggesting it? Well, the secret is in the 50 cals. You can pen almost every tank top down with these at the tier. You can pen every German tier 1 and tier 2 tank with these guns, and you can get most of the Russians too, even the T-34s if you have a good angle. It has very good low speed characteristics as well, which make 90-degree attack and recovery maneuvers pretty easy to pull off. It's also a pretty decent dogfighter too. Now, it is a marketplace vehicle and available in limited numbers, but it's currently around 5.5 Gaijin coin at the moment, and for that you get a versatile premium that can always do something in battle, and for around this price I do recommend it. Next up, another premium, the Corsair. At 2.7, this is a very powerful plane. It comes equipped with a 1000 pound bomb and, like the Martlet, 650 cals as well. I'd say its effectiveness is about on par. It does suffer a bit more at low speeds, which is a bit of a problem as pretty much all the combat and ground forces is at low speed, but it gets a great bomb and more ammo for the guns. I personally find myself preferring the Martlet, but I'd say either of these two would be worth picking up. Next up is the Hellcat Mark II. Again, it's slightly different to the American version, but it plays identically really. This one comes equipped with 2 1000 pound bombs and 6 HVAR rockets, or the option of Tiny Tims. Like the Martlet, it's very stable at low speeds and is great at tackling aircraft or ground forces respectively. It is again a premium, but it's very capable and wouldn't be a waste of money. Next up are the Mosquitoes, both of them, the Mark 6 and the Mark 18. The Mark 6 can carry bombs and RP3s, Whereas the Mark 18 gets a Mollins 57mm cannon, which is pretty adept at knocking out or disabling tanks. It takes a bit of getting used to, and you definitely need a good angle of attack, but when you nail it, you can really do work with this plane. It also comes with its weaponry stock, which is a big advantage. I'd personally suggest you go with the Mark 18, but the previous variant still has some more familiar and easier to use advantages. All in all, they're both good choices. Lastly today is the Firefly Mark 1. It performs well at low speed and comes with 4 20mm cannons, which is nice, and can do some work top down if you have the AP belts. It can also unlock 8 RP3s or 2 £1,000 bombs, which is really nice. It's slow but does have potential. It is a bit tricky stock but can really mop up when spaded. Right, so that's all the vehicles today. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. Before we wrap up today though, these are the best lineups I've come up with for Tier 2 Britain. So, there we are guys, thank you so much for watching, and sorry this one took... Thank you. I mean, it's the middle of the day, don't worry about it, just bull right along past, don't worry about it. Yeah, this is the sort of thing that's delayed the video for quite a while. One of my doors is broken and it can't close, so there's been lots of noise on the street during the day, which has been quite tedious to try and record around. Additionally, I've had lots of electrical work being done, so there's been a fella outside most of the day banging about, and there's loads of holes in my wall. I'll see if I can get a picture of those to put on the video here. Yeah, thank you so much for sticking with me. The next one will hopefully come a lot quicker, as this is the end of all the work, and I will try and duct tape my door closed. Also, this is my light now, and it actually sort of works, but you press the button, a light comes on, which is lovely, but it won't turn off. So it just stays on for about 4 hours, which is amazing. Anyway, I will stop rambling. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.